I call the hearing to order. Our hearing today concerns the cost of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the first panel, Dr. Peter Orszag, Director of the Congressional Budget Office, will discuss the cost of these conflicts, past and present, and will project the cost to come based on two troop-level scenarios, illustrative scenarios. Customarily, CBO has not calculated interest into war-related debt, but in this study, which we've requested, CBO has accrued interest and the effects on total cost are significant. On the second panel, we have two witnesses, Amy Belasco of the Congressional Research Service, who has tracked war costs and prepared numerous excellent reports on the subject, plus Professor Linda Bilmes of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, who researched and published at length articles on the economic and social costs of the war in Iraq. Professor Bilmes is writing a book to be published early next year with updated cost estimates. This hearing builds on what we have started in previous hearings, all aimed at a better understanding of the cost of these ongoing conflicts and, of course, their impact on the budget. While we will be discussing monetary costs measured in billions of dollars, the dearest price has been paid in lost lives and wounded bodies by those serving and serving bravely in Iraq and Afghanistan. So far in Iraq, there have been more than 3,800 military personnel and DoD civilians killed and more than 28,000 wounded. In Afghanistan, more than 400 of our armed forces have been killed, nearly 1,700 wounded. Our troops have performed with valor and honor, and they and their families, too, have sacrificed. As long as they're in harm's way, we owe them our unstinting support and whatever resources are needed to get the job done. In deciding what to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, cost is not the determinant. But the cost to date is substantial, $450 billion in Iraq alone and rising rapidly at $10 to $12 billion a month. When the administration's budget requests for this year are included, the overall cost will top $800 billion. Now, by any yardstick, that's a staggering sum. In constant dollars, the cost is running above the peak spending during Korea or Vietnam, as this next chart shows. When the first war supplemental for 2008 is combined with the base defense budget, the budget for 2008 totals $647 billion. And when the next supplemental, due to arrive shortly, comes, the total will go to $700 billion. Much of this incremental cost will be borrowed, much of it from foreigners, which is why we've asked CBO to calculate the interest cost into its subsidy. As this next slide shows, we have provided more than $600 billion for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, $450 for Iraq alone, according to the Congressional Research Service. 2 days ago, the President submitted another war funding request totaling $46 billion. This increases his 2008 request to $196 billion and makes it the largest supplemental yet. I'll note the fact that strikes me about this particular chart is that as the war has gone on, instead of diminishing as we scored successes, the cost has actually gone up and up and up relentlessly each year to the point where in the current fiscal year the cost is likely to be almost $200 billion. Now that's Iraq and Afghanistan. These increases, however, are attributable mostly to our commitments in Iraq. Of the $800 billion provided through 2008, $600 billion has gone to Iraq. Of the $196 billion requested for 2008, $160 billion will be used in Iraq. Beyond 2008, costs remain significant, but the administration has declined to give us a projection of those costs. The administration's budget in 2009 includes $50 billion as a placeholder, but it provides nothing, no projection, for 2010 and beyond. I wish that was likely, but I think it's unrealistic, particularly if we maintain forces in Afghanistan for some years to come, which we're likely to do, and even if combat operations ended tomorrow in Iraq. Significant reconstitution costs or reset costs would continue for several years to come. The Army and the Marine Corps, for example, stated more than a year ago that together they required $18 billion for reset each year. Reset is refurbishment, repair, and replacement of worn-out and damaged equipment. Each of the services together said that they required at least $18 billion a year For each year they remain engaged in a substantial way in Iraq, and for at least 2 to 3 years after operations in Iraq cease. The administration's latest supplemental indicates that these estimates are low. In the latest supplemental, the administration is asking $46 billion for reconstitution. Now, that's a broader, more inclusive term than reset, but that's reconstitution, resupplying ourselves with equipment that's been worn out, destroyed, or badly damaged. That's $10 billion more than was requested in 2007. While the administration has declined to supply estimates of future operations, the Congressional Budget Office, to its credit, has agreed to try. CBO's estimates rest on illustrative troop scenarios. In one, troop levels draw down to 75,000 in the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters by 2013, and they remain at that level, 75,000 troops in theater, not necessarily in country, through 2017. Under these assumptions, CBO projects the cost of military operations at $966 billion over the 10-year period, 2008 through 2017. And the cost of all operations, all economic aid, training indigenous forces is just over $1 trillion, $1,055 billion to be exact. Add this to the $604 billion already provided or appropriated through 2007, and cumulative cost by 2017 could be an astounding $1.7 trillion. While these costs are enormous, they omit any calculation of interest on the funding borrowed for war operations. And since the government has run substantial deficits from 2003 through 2007, and since future borrowing to some extent can be expected, interest needs to be imputed to the total cost of the war. This expense, as I said, has been previously omitted, but if included, according to CBO, interest cumulatively could be as much as $705 billion by 2017. Added to direct costs, to military operations, to aid, to training of indigenous forces, to reconstruction, and total costs could reach $2.4 trillion by 2017. This estimate, once again, assumes a scenario, the illustrative scenario, in which deployed forces in Iraq and Afghan theaters draw down to 75,000 by 2013. Now, one can quibble with these assumptions. I'd be the first to admit that, and with the methodology. But no one can contest the enormous costs incurred so far in Iraq, or the likelihood that these costs will keep being incurred into the immediate future. The task of the Budget Committee is to balance priorities, provide for the common defense, but also provide for health care of our people, education of our young, transportation, social security, all within the context of a balanced budget. Understanding the cost of our deployments around the world is one step towards balancing choices while balancing the budget, which is why we asked for this study from CBO and why we're having this hearing today. Dr. Orszag, we appreciate you coming. Before turning to you for your statement, let me turn to Mr. Ryan of Wisconsin for any statement he would like to make. Mr. Ryan, our ranking member.
I thank the chairman for yielding and for holding this hearing. This is an important hearing. Since the beginning of the 110th Congress, we've had repeated and vigorous debates about the war in Iraq and its costs, as we should. We've heard comparisons about how much we are spending on the war as opposed to children's health insurance or education programs or what have you. But nothing has really changed. The president continues to send his war funding requests to the Hill, and in the end, he continues to get what he asks for. And when asked in a recent debate, none of the top Democratic presidential candidates was willing to commit to having troops out of Iraq as far in the future as 2013. So the bottom line seems to be this. As long as we have troops in Iraq, Congress will provide funding for them. That being the case, we should continue to finance the war responsibly, and the committee has led the effort in this regard. During the 108th Congress, this committee was the first to include an estimated amount for war costs in the bottom line in our budget. In the 109th Congress, at the urging of this committee, the president followed suit, including his war funding recommendations in the administration's annual budget submissions. The 2008 supplemental request was included in the administration's proposal in February, and the Democrat budget resolution did accommodate this amount. But it is not included in the defense appropriations bill passed either by the House or the Senate this year, and the Democrat majority has put off deliberation on the supplemental until after the new year. In addition, and quite inexplicably to me, the majority has failed to pass the regular defense appropriations and military construction bills, even though both House and Senate have passed this overwhelmingly. At a time when people are so jaded about partisanship, here's something we all have consensus on. This should have been passed already. The fiscal year began 24 days ago, and I distinctly remember the Deputy Secretary of Defense testifying before this committee in July that delays in funding are disruptive to our men and women in combat on the ground and in harm's way. So it seems we really should get on with it, and that is why we are here. We all know that the war entails many costs that cannot be measured in dollars, but it's the area of funding where Congress has its greatest impact. And as long as the funding is going to continue, we have an obligation to do it responsibly. I'm proud of this committee's work, both from the current majority and the old majority, in getting these numbers put into the budget. And if I just could put one thing into perspective, if you could pull up chart number 4, please. I think this puts this debate into perspective. And I don't mean to pull this chart up to try and offset what the chairman just said. I don't disagree with any of the numbers he cited. But let's look at where we are today in our nation's history and what we're confronting. This is a new ism. This is a world war like different past world wars in size and scope. We are facing a mortal threat. Radical Islamic totalitarianism is a mortal threat to this country. It's a mortal threat to our civilization and our way of life. And we have to be prepared for this. And so when you take a look at the sacrifice we have made in our federal budget, when you take a look at what the American people have paid for in past conflicts that rise to the level of this conflict, it's really quite low. This is the chart that shows as a percentage of our economy, the spending on defense as a percentage of GDP. We are down close to 4% right now in the post-9/11 era. The 50-year average is 6.2% of GDP we have dedicated toward national defense. In Vietnam, we were above 8%. In Korea, we were about 11%. In the Cold War buildup, we were at about 6% of GDP. So as a percentage of our economy, as a proportion of our federal budget, we're well below the 50-year average, even though we are now in the midst of confronting one of the greatest mortal threats to our country and our civilization, which is a threat to democracy and freedom worldwide. So it's important to put this in perspective. Equally important is the job of this committee to make sure that we're not doing this in fits and starts. Equally, to make sure that we do this within our budget so that we can have rational debate, so that we can prepare for the future, and we can save efficiencies in the process. And to that end, I think CBO is doing a good job. I think CBO ought to be commended for putting these estimates together, I think at the request of the chairman, on what will this look like in the out years. What will this look like if we have 75,000 troops in 2013, 30,000 troops thereon after? That is the kind of debate we ought to be having. We should be putting these in the base budget. But let's remember the fact that we do have a real conflict on our hands that's not going away anytime soon. We have to acknowledge that, put it in our budget, and let's look at the fact that we're doing this so much more efficiently with so fewer dollars than we ever did before when we had other kinds of conflicts of this nature. With that, I yield the balance of my time, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
Thank you very much for an excellent opening statement, Mr. Ryan. And now, before turning to Dr. Orzog, let me attend to a couple of housekeeping details. First of all, I ask unanimous consent that all members be allowed to submit an opening statement at this point in the record without objection, so ordered. Now, Dr. Orzog, we'll go directly to you. First, let me thank you for the diligent, good work, as usual, you've done in preparing the report that you bring to us today. We look forward to your explanation of it. Secondly, you will constitute a panel of one. When your testimony is concluded, we'll have questions, and then we'll have the second panel follow you, if that's agreeable. I got you. Your written testimony has been pre-filed, and it'll be made part of the record. You can summarize it as you see fit, but I encourage you to take your time in walking us through it so that we'll have a full and complete understanding of it. Thank you again for coming. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Ryan, members of the committee. U.S. operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the global war on terrorism have important effects for the nation and for the individuals directly involved that go well beyond their effect on the federal budget. My job in my testimony this morning, though, focuses on the narrower issues surrounding those budget costs. The testimony delineates three types of budget costs: past spending, potential future spending, and borrowing costs. First, the past. As the first chart shows, from September 2001 through the end of fiscal year 2007, the Congress appropriated $602 billion for military operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other activities associated with the war on terrorism. This funding has been rising rapidly, roughly doubling from between 2003 and 2007, as you see on the chart, from $88 billion to $170 billion. A disproportionate amount of that growth has been experienced in the area of procurement, which rose from about $1 billion in 2003 to more than $50 billion in 2007. Much of that growth, in turn, is related to the so-called reconstitution and related reset programs, which are intended to repair or replace damaged equipment. CBO's analysis of those programs, however, suggests that a significant share of the funding has been devoted to substantial upgrades or new purchases to expand capacity above pre-war levels, rather than simply to replace or repair damaged equipment. In addition to the $602 billion in funds that were explicitly appropriated for the war, CBO estimates that the Veterans Administration has spent an additional $2 billion for war-related benefits. Including this VA-related spending, funding for the war through 2007 has amounted to $604 billion, as shown in the second table. As that table also shows, the vast bulk of this $604 billion, that's the first column, provided to date through the end of 2007, has been for the Department of Defense. That's that $533 billion you see in the upper left corner of the first column. DoD is currently obligating an average of almost $11 billion a month for expenses associated with the war. Most of that is related, about $9 billion per month, for operations in Iraq. I'd also note that war-related appropriations now account for about a quarter of the department's overall budget. The remainder of the $604 billion provided to date is, and in addition to the VA spending that I already mentioned, comes in two different categories. First, approximately $30 billion has been provided to establish, train, and equip indigenous security forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and roughly $39 billion has been provided for reconstruction and relief efforts, diplomatic operations, embassy construction, foreign aid, and economic support. Okay, that's the past. In terms of the future, CBO has projected the cost of activities associated with operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war on terrorism under two possible scenarios. The projections for both scenarios are based on the assumption that the increased troop levels currently in theater in Iraq will be sustained for nearly 12 months and then reduced. I'd also note that the scenarios are meant to serve as an illustration of the budgetary impact of two possible courses in the war on terrorism, but they are not intended to be a precise prediction of what will occur. In the first scenario, the number of personnel deployed on the ground for the war on terrorism would be reduced from an average of about 200,000 in fiscal year 2008 to 30,000 by the by the beginning of fiscal year 2010, and then remain at that level through 2017. CBO estimates that future costs to the government under this scenario would total $570 billion over the next decade, as you can see at the bottom of the second column in this chart. In the second scenario, the number of personnel deployed to Iraq and other locations associated with the war on terrorism would decline more gradually, falling from 200,000 this year to 75,000 by the end of fiscal year 2013, and then remain at that level through 2017. Under that scenario, CBO estimates that future costs would total more than $1 trillion over the next decade. Again, you see that at the bottom of the final column in the chart. Including both past funding and projected funding under these two illustrative scenarios, total spending for U.S. operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the rest of the war on terrorism would thus amount to between $1.2 trillion and $1.7 trillion through 2017. In addition, CBO does not traditionally include the cost of borrowing in our analysis of specific programs. However, in this case, the Budget Committee requested that we compute the additional debt service costs that would accrue if past and future spending on the war were financed entirely by borrowing. If such spending were entirely financed by borrowing, the additional debt that the government would accumulate would entail higher interest payments. Under the assumption that past spending has been deficit financed, CBO estimates that the additional interest payments would total $415 billion through 2017. In addition, if the future spending paths that are shown on this chart were also deficit financed, interest payments would go up by another $175 billion to $290 billion. In other words, the bottom line is that to the extent the spending is not offset by higher taxes or reduced spending elsewhere in the budget, and therefore simply adds to the deficit, the total budgetary impact of the war, including spending to date, possible future spending, and higher interest costs, would amount to between $1.7 trillion and $2.4 trillion through 2017. A final part of my written testimony addresses some differences between CBO estimates and other estimates of the cost of the war that have been produced by private researchers, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions about those differences. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Orzag. Let me make clear, the interest rate you have assumed is 4.8%. Is there a Treasury rate that's assumed for the full forecast period?
The debt service calculations use our baseline interest rate assumptions, and so when you have an extra dollar of debt outstanding, you pay the interest rate that's embodied in our baseline, and it is approximately the level that you suggest.
But the rate of interest you assumed, is this a Treasury rate of interest?
Yes, yes, as is appropriate since the additional borrowing is federal government borrowing.
So you aren't assuming any uptick in interest rates due to this fiscal situation. You're taking simply a constant interest rate number that's the prevailing rate used by Treasury today.
That is correct. Incorporating any effect of the additional borrowing on the interest cost itself would be a form of macroeconomic dynamic analysis that is not traditionally done by CBO.
In addition, as you look at these costs, would you give us just a brief description of the difficulty it is to separate out the costs in the different accounts of the Department of Defense so that you can identify it with Iraq or Afghanistan or the rest of the world or stateside expenditures? What sort of extrapolation do you have to do to arrive at these numbers?
We don't have full transparency into the systems that the Department of Defense uses to allocate funding into different categories, and I would note that there's a particular challenge in outlays, that is the money that is actually spent as opposed to the budget authority that is provided by the Congress, because on the outlay side things are mixed together in ways that are very hard to separate out. On the budget authority side, while there are still some shortcomings and we would benefit from more access to the cost models that the Defense Department itself uses to project future costs, there have been some improvements over the past couple of years in terms of transparency and the ability to separate out the relevant information.
And basically, you're not auditors, you're economists, and you have to do some extrapolation and some interpolation in order to arrive at these numbers and give us an estimate of it. Have you, in the past, when you've done this, received any criticism from the Department of Defense, or have there been specific objections made to specific forecasts that you produced by DOD?
To my knowledge, there was one incident in which there was some criticism, but I believe that the facts have proven us to be correct, and that had to do with the size and therefore the cost of the so-called surge that has occurred this year. We put out an analysis earlier this year trying to delineate the potential size of that given the number of brigades that the administration had identified as being involved in it, and there was some administration criticism of those figures. But as the facts have turned out, I believe our analysis has proven to be correct.
Well, you referred to transparency. Have you approached the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, the Comptroller, and asked for an opportunity to see into their books and to get more specificity in developing the numbers that you've used here?
Our staff is in regular contact with the Defense Department staff.
Okay. Once again, to go over what you've come up with here, the total cost they got in the headlines today is $2.4 trillion, but that's sort of the worst case scenario, I suppose.
That is the highest number that's contained in our testimony. I don't know whether it's a worst case scenario because we don't know whether the two future scenarios that we've laid out are actually defining the space of what could be the worst case scenario or not.
Well, the most extreme case that you presented is $2.4 trillion, everything included, interest specifically included as well. The least amount is, of your second case, the lesser amount is the brackets is what I'm trying to get at.
Oh, with additional debt service costs would be 1.7 trillion.
So the cost ranges you've got, dependent on these two illustrative scenarios, is 1.7 billion to 2.4 trillion.
That's
Trillion.
correct.
Excuse me.
That's
Doesn't
correct.
come easily off my tongue.
That is correct as long as all of the spending is financed by deficits. In other words, it's not offset by lower spending elsewhere or higher taxes.
Let me let others answer questions that you may have, but thank you once again for the study and for your testimony, Mr. Ryan.
Thank you. Peter, let me ask you about your baseline assumptions. Do you include you include the war spending in your baseline, correct?
Our baseline is based on whatever has been enacted as of the sort of
Most recent.
The most recent. So it does have supplemental funding embodied in it, yes.
Right. So it's whatever the last supplemental is, you just carry that out into the baseline.
With
correct?
inflation, correct.
Right. With inflation. Okay. So if you think war spending is going to decline based on these drawdown scenarios you outlined, or if it does in fact do what, you know, the 75,000 or the 30,000, does the baseline decline consistently with that?
No.
Right. So are we not overstating the outlays in the future if we believe these scenarios will come to be true?
Oh, now I get to be the two-handed economist. On the one hand, yes, because of the fact that you noted. On the other hand, there are lots of things, both on the non-defense side, where people believe that it's possible that non-defense discretionary spending will keep pace not just with inflation, which is the baseline assumption, but with population growth and economic growth. And then even within defense, our analysis of the Defense Department's future plans as embodied in the Future Year Defense Plan suggests that there may be significant additional costs beyond inflation that are embodied in the current thrust of defense policy.
So all that will be soaked up by new plans.
It could be.
Could you bring up chart number 3, please? Whoever's doing number 3. This is constant FY08 dollars budget, the Defense Department Budget Authority. If you take a look at this historically in our history over these conflicts, spending shoots up, goes up at a very high level, and then comes back down and gravitates toward the average. Do you have reason to believe that this kind of a conflict, even though you look at the Cold War, which was a long-lasting conflict, this one is probably a long-lasting one like that. Do you believe that history will not repeat itself, that we will not go back down toward the average, or do you believe that we are going to have an ever-increasing, ever in perpetuity escalating increase in costs for DOD?
Again, all I can say is if you look at the Defense Department's future plans themselves, and we will be coming out with an updated analysis of our own analysis of those future plans over the next decade and beyond, they do entail increasing costs. Whether or not that will turn out to be the case, you know, history will tell.
If I can get it, just, okay, so, and when you say that, what comes to my mind is the fact that they want 20 new light brigades for the Army and perhaps 20 new light brigades for the Marines to have the kinds of soldiers that we need for this kind of a conflict, so we're not stretching our Guard and Reserves too much. Is that not what kind of you're talking about?
They want upgraded and new equipment and
right.
and you have ongoing healthcare cost inflation that's
Right.
occurring in that system as well, and there are a variety of upward pressures on the defense
Right,
budget.
and so that is assuming that that is all on top of, not in place of what they're doing and what they have, correct?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Well, that is assuming new on top of. They're not going to cut anything to make room, physical space for these new needs. They're just going to throw these new needs on top in their requests.
there are some offsetting things, but again, if you look at their plans themselves,
Right.
The offsets are not as big.
Not nearly as big as what the plans may be.
Right.
So therein lies maybe a role for this committee to play, I would think, which is we entered this conflict with a Cold War military, with a Cold War posture, with Cold War assets and equipment and mechanized divisions, and perhaps we now recognize in the 21st century there's a different kind of a military we need, and perhaps this committee can play a constructive role in making sacrifices and choices as to do we need to have it all, or do we need to have more 21st century-based systems and therefore not as much 20th century-based systems. You know, people talk about bases in Germany and other places that no longer present an immediate threat to us. This is something this committee could probably play a constructive role in, I would argue. And so I just think it's important to note that our nation's history shows we ramp it up during these conflicts, and then it comes back down toward the mean afterwards. So it is not something we can confidently predict. We're going to have in perpetuity higher always spending on defense. But also I think it's important to note, given the earlier chart we brought up, that we are fighting this war with a lot less cost and a lot less sacrifice than we ever have fought wars before as a percentage of our ability to pay for it. And I think that's just a noteworthy point. With that, I yield. Thank you, Chairman.
Before turning to Mr. Lauro, let me get a clarification. Now, the ranking member, Mr. Ryan, asked about the carry forward of enacted supplementals. And typically, your convention is to carry forward enacted appropriations in projecting the future, including a supplemental. If it was enacted, you will carry it forward for future years.
That's correct.
What we've asked you to do here was to not carry it forward, but to develop a different model for extrapolating or projecting into the future. So I just want to make it clear, we didn't have a 10-year carry forward of the supplementals. We had a different set of carry forward numbers, projected numbers, based upon the two assumptions we gave you. One is to reduce to 30,000 troops. The other is to go to 75,000 troops.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
May I just
Sure.
just on that? So under some of these scenarios, off of your current baseline, we could be saving money, correct?
It is, again, just looking at the component that has to do with the war on terrorism, that is possible especially under the lower cost scenario for the future.
Thank you.
Mrs. DeLauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Orszag. Let me ask just a couple of questions. Is it true, Dr. Orszag, that we are spending more on defense in this effort in constant dollars than we spent in World War II? Since World War II, I'm sorry, since World War II.
CBO has not done that analysis. I have seen some estimates from the Congressional Research Service, and I'll, I guess, defer to the next panel for you to get the answers from them. The only thing I would note is when looking over very long periods of time, economists typically like to look at things as a share of the economy rather than just in constant dollars.
Mm-hmm. And but in terms of looking at it as a percentage of the economy, then should we make that same application to non-defense discretionary spending if we're looking at
again, over long periods of time, the best perspective on something involving the budget is typically as a share of the economy if you're going out more than 10, 20, 30 years kind of time span.
Mm-hmm. Let me and let me just follow because I just want to have clarity on the carryover of unobligated 2007 funding. DOD received $170 billion of supplemental funding for 2007. How much of that amount will carry over and remain available for obligation in 2008?
My understanding is that something probably a little bit under $50 billion and maybe in the $30 to $50 billion range of funds already provided in budget authority have not yet been obligated.
Mm-hmm. You made the point about that we're dealing with procurement and not replacing equipment, et cetera. Do you have any way, or is it under your jurisdiction in any way, to take a look at that? What you said is that the $39 billion. I'm trying to find your comments here. $39 million that we're spending on reconstruction, et cetera. Do you do anything by way of looking at those numbers and can determine what is dealing with any kind of overspending, any kind of waste, fraud, abuse efforts? Is that do you do those kinds of calculations?
I would say that's more of an activity for GAO rather than
Mm-hmm.
CBO.
Mm-hmm. So that you're just dealing with the aggregate numbers and what the cost of that spending is with regard to construction, et cetera.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Resume their position when they come back. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Herzog, I have the privilege of chairing the Appropriations Subcommittee on the Veterans Administration and Military Construction, so I'd like to focus my questions on the long-term monetary cost of treating veterans injured or those suffering from mental illnesses as a result of their service in Iraq and Afghanistan, respecting the fact there's no way to put a dollar value on the sacrifice of these great Americans. As I understand it, you've estimated the 10-year cost of medical cost for the VA for the Iraq and Afghan war veterans is between $7 and $9 billion. Is that correct?
That's correct. And then there's some additional disability and other component to get you up to the $9 to $13 billion range that I showed on the chart.
So
That's
$7 to $9 billion for medical care, and if you add disability compensation, which is VA compensation to those injured in combat, it would possibly go up to $13 billion. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right.
Range of 9 to 13, yeah.
Now, let me ask, have you projected the cost, because they will be real as well as painful, financially and physically and mentally, but have you projected the lifetime financial cost for medical care for the veterans, or just a 10-year period?
We have, at this point, just done, a 10-year period.
Would it be difficult to try to take the analysis you've done and project that to get the real cost of the war projected over a lifetime? Because obviously, while for economic purposes and budget purposes it makes sense to use a 10-year timeline, when we're talking about real Americans who have sacrificed greatly, at the end of 10 years there's not going to be a magic solution to their health care problems. Would it be possible for you to do it, and if so, how long would that take?
It would be possible. There is an additional complexity, which is that veterans often use the VA for some time, and then they'll use part of the rest of the healthcare system for part, and then come back. And those transitions we have somewhat more confidence about for a 10-year period, and over a lifetime they become a lot harder to model.
Right.
But we could potentially take a stab at doing so.
Okay, good. I would appreciate that. In projecting future health care costs, what inflation factor did you use? Did you use Consumer Price Index or the health care inflation index, which I believe is significantly higher than the Consumer Price Index?
I would think that we used the healthcare inflation rate. Yes, yeah.
You did use that. Could you make that number available to the committee?
Absolutely.
Please. There have been, out of 1.5 million Americans who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, 750,000 approximately have been discharged. Of those, 250,000, a huge percentage, have already sought medical care in VA hospitals. 95,000 of those 250,000 have been treated for mental health care, and of those, 45,000 have apparently full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you tell me what estimates, how you determine the estimate of the number of veterans coming back from the war with mental health care problems, including PTSD?
Well, they're based on many of the same data that you just related. And one of the complexities in going forward is, do you believe that the incidence rate of PTSD will be higher or lower than what we've observed so far? On the one hand, it may well be that there are folks who are undiagnosed but are suffering from PTSD, and therefore the incidence rate would be higher. On the other hand, it may well be that the people who are coming in and being diagnosed are disproportionately those who suffer from it. And so therefore, as you roll out over time and have the rest of the population involved, the incidence rate would not be as high as what you've already observed.
But you used actual numbers from this war. You didn't use, for example, the Persian Gulf War as a model for determining what the percentage of injuries or mental health care cases would be.
One of the factors that went into our set of projections is the experience in the Persian Gulf War from people who used the VA relative to how much use there
would
have been.
If I could, just because time is
Sure.
short, I think I have 20 seconds left. In terms of mental health care issues, clearly there can be very little comparison between the Persian
That's
Gulf
correct.
War, which lasted for several days in this war, which has now lasted longer than World War II. Could you submit to the committee the assumptions that you used in determining the number of veterans who would need mental health care and PTSD services?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Edwards, now, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Orszag, thank you for being with us again. I had several questions. First, I wanted to clarify, in your testimony, you indicate that DOD is currently obligating about $11 billion a month for activities in Iraq and Afghanistan and other aspects of the global war on terror. It's true, is it not, that $9 billion a month of that is currently related to the war in Iraq?
That's approximately correct, yes.
A little bit more than $9 billion?
It's in the range of $9 billion, yes.
I would like to have chart 3 put up for a moment, if we can. The direct budgetary costs, I'm not blaming you for this, but the direct budgetary costs of the war in Iraq are astonishing. I mean, when we, if the President's request is met, the total direct budget cost will be $611 billion. That is a staggering amount of money, way beyond any projection that was ever made at the beginning. And then if I could turn to chart number 5. Chart number 5 indicates that if you add in the funding through 07, then the 2008 request, do the projected future costs on the more gradual drawdown that you mentioned, which would leave us with 50 or 60,000 troops in Iraq after 2013. If you do all that and then calculate interest on the war-related debt, the overall number is $2.4 trillion, but it's true, is it not, Dr. Orszag, that approximately 1.9 of that $2.4 trillion is related to the war in Iraq on that kind of calculation?
We didn't specifically parse out Iraq versus other components of the war on terrorism for the future scenarios, but if historical patterns evolved in the same way in the future, you'd wind up with a number that was approximately the figure you gave.
Approximately 1.9 billion trillion.
Maybe a little less,
Sorry.
but
Would the gentleman yield for just a friendly question?
Yes.
Doesn't your budget resolution balance the budget by 2012? So
Thank you for the question.
No, but I
let me
mean,
go. Let me
but for
go.
5
Let me
years
go
you
back.
wouldn't be
I'm trying
including
to.
those
I'm trying to understand this. You and I can talk about that later. Dr. Orszag, let me come back to this. You said earlier on that DOD doesn't break down Iraq costs separately from Afghanistan, particularly with respect to outlays. That with respect to budget authority, they're getting a little better in terms of segregating the costs in Iraq and the costs in Afghanistan. Is that right?
yes.
Is there any reason why DOD could not do that if they were directed by Congress to be more specific in segregating the costs, both for budget authority and for outlays in terms of those two conflicts?
My understanding is on the outlay side, that would require a very significant change in the budget system used at the Department of Defense. So I don't want, I could get back to you in writing about the specific changes that would be required, but it would not be a trivial undertaking.
Okay, okay. Then I guess, so we're going to keep getting these costs lumped together. That's very difficult because, of course, the support for the conflict in Afghanistan and rebuilding in Afghanistan is very different from the public support for or the lack of public support for this ongoing conflict in Iraq.
But just to be clear, again, the biggest difficulty is on the outlay side where things are, for the war on terrorism, mingled together with other spending. In terms of the budget authority that you are providing, it is, while it may not be perfect, there is a lot more transparency about what's going where.
And could we enhance that transparency by action of this committee?
I'm not sure that there are additional steps necessary. I think that in terms of projecting future costs, there is more transparency that could be provided to us through, for example, access to the cost model that the Department of Defense uses.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. Mr. Boyd, and let me say first that Mr. Doggett and Ms. Becerra are leaving. When they come back from their markup in Ways and Means Committee, we'll reinstate your position in the pecking order. Okay. But you want to yield to Mr. Boyd to go forward. Alan Boyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing where obviously we're here today to talk about the cost of our operations in Iran and Afghanistan and other related costs, and not only the current cost, but the long-term cost and how we might pay for that. But ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear on one thing, that this is a situation that we have created that has no good solution. I know many of us as members have been to Iraq. I've been within the last 3 weeks. This is a situation, ladies and gentlemen, where we have assumed the job of policing the streets of Iraq and refereeing a civil war. The Iraqi security forces can be stood up, are trained, but they can never be effective until the Iraqi government stands up and creates a command and control system and a logistical support system that will allow them to be effective. So in my view, I think that we are in it for the long haul unless we understand that the war on terror, which Mr. Ryan spoke so eloquently about, and the moral threat, is one that exists all around the world. And the al-Qaeda operatives are working in at least 100 countries, Mr. Ryan, not just in Iraq. There were none there until we toppled the government there. So we are in pretty much a quagmire that there is no good solution to, that many people in the administration would not want you to understand what the long-term costs are. And as Mr. Edwards has spoken about the long-term veterans health care costs, which have not been spoken for in the future, the debt service, which is one that those of us who are Blue Dogs are very interested in. We think that we ought to pay as we go. We don't think we ought to borrow money, Mr. Ryan, to fund the government, those things which protect our strategic interest. And also, Mr. Orstag, I want to ask you, Dr. Orstag, about the reset costs. You've spoken eloquently about the debt service and the $705 billion, which I see on your chart, or someone's chart. That's about 30% or so of the total cost, the long-term cost of the war. But you have not spoken in depth about the reset costs, which obviously are very serious. And if we're going to restore ourselves to the position that Mr. Ryan put up in his chart, chart number 4, where he outlined the cost of this in terms of gross domestic product. I hope that we can see my friend put up that kind of chart when we deal with overall cost of the government, including domestic cost, which Ms. DeLauro has spoken to. That would be, if we're going to play this game, we ought to play where we compare apples to apples in the long run. We ought not to talk about cost in one term when we talk about domestic cost, and in a different term when we talk about national security interest. So, Dr. Orstag, can you talk to us a little bit about reset costs and what the long-term future holds for us in terms of preparing our military once this is over?
Yes, and actually coming back to a question that Mr. Allen had asked, in the area of reset costs and the related area of reconditioning, there is not as much transparency as one would hope. And that is an area in which more transparency about exactly what is happening would be useful. We put out a study of the subset of reset, in other words, the reset program where you're trying to repair or replace damaged equipment. And what we found is that a substantial amount of the funding that has been provided, about 40%, has been not to repair or replace something that was damaged or destroyed, but rather to significantly upgrade it or to get something new. So, for example, in the funding that was provided under the reset program, there were 120 M1A2 tanks that were enhanced to the System Enhancement Program, SEP configuration, which costs about $5 million a tank, and it's substantially beyond what would be entailed in simply returning a damaged tank to its original state. So an issue for the Congress is how much of this money, which is supposed to be for repairing and replacing damaged or destroyed equipment, is actually being used to upgrade and to replenish the capital stock of trucks and tanks and what have you. Our analysis suggests that if you continue fully funding all of these requests, the military will wind up in a better position in terms of its equipment, tanks, et cetera, than before the war.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, this may be a question for the next panel, but in terms of what may be lost or left when we leave, and let's make no mistake about it, we will draw down numbers significantly and equipment out of that country significantly in the near future. What will the cost of that be?
To remove the equipment?
No. To what we may leave or may have been lost.
Again, that will depend on how much is left. So I can't give you a specific answer.
We'll ask that of the next panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Board, let me turn for 2 minutes to Mr. Ryan, then we'll go into Mr. Doggett, if that's agreeable. He wanted a chance to respond.
Let me just make an inquiry before he begins. I assume by Mr. Ryan being here that every member of this panel, including every Republican member on that side of the aisle where all the seats are vacant, received notice of this hearing about the cost of the war in Iraq?
I feel sure they did.
And when was that notice of the hearing sent out?
Tom? 7 days ago, as required by rule.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you. I just want to ask a couple quick questions and just follow up, Mr. Boyd. I agree these things ought to all be done in context, percentage of GDP, and I think you'll find that it's shifted from defense over to more domestic issues. And as we saw from the Comptroller General, we have a big problem on our hands going as a percentage of GDP in the future. The reason I stuck with defense is that's what this hearing's about. Peter, I just have one quick question since, I'm kind of the only Republican here, is taking these numbers, you have $1.7 trillion cost with interest on the 30,000 level and then the $2.4 trillion cost with interest in it at the 2013 level. If the majority's budget resolution occurs and is implemented and executed and we do not have deficits after 2012 and therefore we're not debt financing it, what is the savings off of those figures that you would achieve if what they're saying they're going to do does in fact happen and we are not deficit financing these things afterwards?
Well, it's still the case that even after you're running a surplus in the baseline, that if additional spending reduces the surplus, you're not buying down debt as much as you would otherwise, and therefore there are additional interest costs. So the same logic still.
Not the same interest costs, though, of additional debt financing versus canceling out, correct? Versus foregone cancellation, is that you're imputing the same interest rate either way you go?
Yeah, in other words, if you have $1 trillion in debt outstanding and you add $100 billion to it, there's some interest on that. If you would have reduced it by $100 billion, run a surplus, but instead you don't, you have more interest than under the baseline.
So you're saying regardless of whether we're in deficit or surplus, the costs are the same?
Under the assumption that the additional spending is not offset elsewhere in the budget, you're looking at the marginal impact on debt outstanding and then higher interest costs. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much for your testimony. With reference to the monies that have already been expended, about what percentage of those figures are attributable to the war in Iraq?
Roughly 70%.
About 70%. And hasn't that varied at times, sometimes much higher, but seldom lower?
Well, earlier on it was lower while we were concentrated disproportionately in Afghanistan.
Earlier on, everything was lower. I'm sure you recall that when the president's top economist, Lawrence Lindsay, suggested that perhaps the initial White House figure of $50 billion for the total cost over all time for the war in Iraq might be off a little bit, they found him another job outside the administration. If I understand the burn figures as they're referred to presently, we currently spend in about 4 months in Iraq what the White House told the American people initially would be the cost of the total war. Is that about right?
We're spending roughly $11 trillion. I'm sorry, $11 billion a month.
Well, maybe we actually got an estimate of $12 billion from witnesses this summer from the Pentagon, but perhaps 5 months to spend or almost 5 months to spend the amount of money now American taxpayers, American people are being asked to expend or borrow the money to finance this, that the total cost of the war was alleged to have cost. And then can you tell us, I know that since the President declared mission accomplished, we've had about 97% of all of the service members that we have lost who've been killed in Iraq, who've died since he declared mission accomplished. Do you know about how much money has been spent in Iraq since the President declared mission accomplished?
Well, I think it'd be pretty easy to get off of the table that we provided, so we could add that up for you and provide it to you.
Thank you. And as far as whether the accuracy and the veracity of the story from the White House has changed any since these initial estimates of $50 billion in Iraq, you made reference to the analysis that CBO did, that your office did, of the cost of this tragic surge that the President has embarked on. And your analysis showed that the cost of the surge would be substantially greater this year than the White House tried to sell the American people on, didn't you?
Yes, and this was, and maybe I can just explain for a moment, this was an area I had been asked earlier in which the administration explicitly criticized something that CBO did.
Yes, sir, and it is that point that I wanted to focus on, their reaction to a study that was done to try to analyze, so we would have the facts here in Congress of what the true cost in dollars, not in blood, we know that is very high, but the true cost in dollars would be this year. They said that your estimate was inflated, did they not?
They used some inflammatory language, yes, sir.
I think it was stronger than that, and in fact, they had apparently omitted to include the support troops. They
Yes.
just had they just put the people that are out on the front lines, but they didn't consider, I know they contract a lot of that out to Blackwater and the like, but they didn't consider any of the support cost or all of the support cost for those troops.
And in particular, I remember this quite well because it was very early in my tenure, so it sticks in my memory. The administration had announced an increase of 5 brigades in the theater, and we're assuming that we're counting only direct combat troops in terms to get their roughly 20,000 troop increase. Our national security team, which is outstanding, pointed out that you never send combat troops in without military police and the people who help feed them and all of the other support behind them, and that there was no way that you'd send in 5 brigades with only 20,000 troops.
Yes, sir. Well, and looking again throughout this year to see if the veracity index or the mendacity index perhaps of the White House has changed any since that initial $50 billion for the total cost of the war. At the beginning of the year, we were told that we would need next year $147 billion. On July the 31st, talking from your chair, we were told it might be in $165 to $170 billion range. What is the current request total to this Congress to pay for the war in Iraq next year?
Slightly under $200 billion.
So it's already risen to slightly under, it's about 196
That's
billion,
correct.
something like that. And in terms of the total cost, you were asked whether it was the worst case scenario. It's not a scenario in your estimates, the $8,000 per every person. It's not a scenario that you defined, it's one you were given. It does not consider what the cost would be if Vice President Cheney is successful in launching an attack on Iran. It doesn't consider what the cost would be if we kept the current troop levels there in Iraq. But if it's $2.4 trillion, can you just give us some comparison to, say, the budget today, or what $2.4 trillion would purchase that the ordinary American citizen could begin to understand what it means to pay out $8,000 per person?
Well, there's no question that $2.4 trillion is a lot of money. I understand that you and your colleagues have provided many such comparisons
How
for
does
the
it
American
compare
public,
to
so
the
I'll leave it
size
at
of
that.
the federal, the entire federal budget today? What is that?
It's more than that, but again, that's a 10-year, that's over an extended period of
Yes,
time, and then it's difficult to compare it to a one-year figure.
But the total amount over 10 years would be about what portion of the total federal budget today?
You want me to, again, the 2.4 trillion is over actually
is-
more than 10 years, and then it would be it would be, I don't know, 3/4 or so of
What
1
we are-
year's
what we
federal
spend
budget.
today.
But
Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure that, I wouldn't normally do that kind of comparison.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Toggett. Mr. Smith.
Excuse me, I apologize for arriving here late from a markup in another committee. When you talk about reset costs, what would you point to as something that might be neglected that we may need to address 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road rather than 2 years down the road?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean, sir.
With the reset costs
Yeah.
of replacing equipment and various other items, long term. I mean, we're finding out now that some of the equipment is needing to be replaced that was not replaced 10 years ago, maybe should have been. So we're starting to see some increased costs now, and certainly the war on terror exacerbates the entire issue. Could you elaborate on
Sure.
that at all?
And again, we have the most dramatic increases in costs over the past several years have been in the area of procurement, and part of that is related to the RESET program. I would just note, though, that the RESET program now is being so aggressively funded that our analysis suggests that it is more than offsetting what it is supposedly designed to do, which is to replace or repair equipment that's damaged in theater. In other words, it is leading to a net improvement in the quality and number of tanks and trucks and what have you relative to pre-war
So, I mean,
because of the money that you're providing to it.
okay. Excuse me. I understand, I think, where you're going with this. Now, if a 1990, and my years probably aren't accurate, but if a 1990 tank is needed to be replaced, what would you suggest replacing it with?
Well, again, I think the question is not whether a 1990 tank needs to be replaced, but rather whether if a 1995 or 1998 tank is damaged in theater, whether the purpose of the emergency funding that's provided for the RESET program is to restore it to operational, to its original state, or whether the funds should be used to purchase a 2007 or 2008 high technology tank. And a significant component of what's happening is the latter. And again, that's up to you. It's just that the way that the program is being described is that it's designed just to offset the impact of the war on that 1998 tank, and that's not all that's happening.
Okay. Thank you.
With the consent of the members on our side, I'm going to allow Mr. Becerra to go ahead since he's got to leave for a markup and a vote imminently. So I recognize at this point Mr. Becerra.
I thank the chairman. I thank my colleagues for that. Dr. Orszag, thanks very much for your testimony. I'd like to actually, I'm first disheartened that no one from the administration and from the Department of Defense took the opportunity and the invitation of this committee to come and testify about what has to be one of the most important things that we're facing, is how to pay for this ongoing military operation in Iraq. I'm also saddened to learn that even though the administration is not willing to be here, what we're finding today is not that we're seeing the tail end of the costs for this war begin to occur, but we're actually seeing costs on an annual basis rise to pay for the president's adventure in Iraq. My understanding is that every single cent of this war, and to date we're looking at over $500 billion, has been paid for with a government credit card, because not a single cent of it has been paid for. Neither has the president ever requested that we tried to pay for any particular expense for the military campaign in Iraq, which during times of record deficits and difficulties with other programs makes it very difficult to understand. I want to pick up on something that my colleague Mr. Doggett had mentioned, that ordinary Americans hear us talking about billions and now, of course, trillions of dollars for the Iraq War, but rarely do we put it in terms that the average American can understand. If we could turn to chart number 1, I'd like to just go through a few of these charts with you, Dr. Orszag. My understanding is that if the war costs continue under these, in some cases, pretty rosy scenarios, we might expect to spend somewhere in the order of $2.4 trillion by the time we get to 2017. My understanding is that we have a lot of chicken littles out there in the world saying that Social Security won't be around. Well, $2.4 trillion is over half of what it would cost us to stabilize Social Security for the next 75 years. Any dispute with that particular figure?
Without disputing that $2.4 trillion is a significant sum, I would point out that that comparison does suffer from the flaw that the $4.7 trillion is in present value and the $2.4 trillion is not, and therefore it's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison.
No, not exactly, but I think even then the oranges look pretty ugly. Can we go to the next chart, number 2? Again, the war request by the President just for the year 2008 dwarfs what the President said we could not spend for 10 million children in this country so that they could have health insurance. That to me is perhaps the most astonishing, that the President said he had to veto the children's health care bill that would cover 10 million kids for a year who have no health insurance because we couldn't afford it. And there you show that 40 days of Iraq war activity would more than cover the expense. And when you see the chart that compares the two, the $196 billion that the President requested for 2008 war funding compared to the $12 billion that we would spend for 2008 to cover 10 million kids, I think it's pretty dramatic. Chart number 3, if I could have that one put up. I think my colleague from Texas, Mr. Edwards, went through this. I think it's hard for anyone to understand why it is that the President is willing to spend so much on the war and not even have to pay for it using the government credit card, yet his request for our veterans falls way behind. In fact, it falls behind what the Congress was willing to do when it comes to trying to protect our veterans. Chart number 6, or 5, excuse me. Is it 6? Chart 6, excuse me. Chart number 6. As many of you know, California right now has 500,000 people who've been evacuated from their homes. We've had some 6 people who've been killed, dozens of people who've been injured as a result of these fires, many of them first responders. We have over 1,200 homes or buildings that have been destroyed, and there still is no end in sight. Yet, as you can see, the funding for the war dwarfs what we would spend for our first responders. And clearly, again, here the President way underfunds our war responders and even what Congress is trying to do. But I think the interesting thing about this chart is that the bar on the left, the $25 billion, is the cost of borrowing money. That's not the cost of funding the war. That's just to pay the interest on the money that the President is requesting. That's what happens when you don't pay for something and you use the government credit card. Ultimately, you have to pay for it. Well, the cost of paying, the interest payments, which have no value because it's just interest payments on debt, exceed by a tremendous amount what we're willing to spend on our first responders back in our home states. Charts 8, if we go to charts quickly, charts 8, and then I'll go to chart 9. Again, put more in perspective what we're talking about spending, again, on the government credit card, because that $330 million a day is not paid for. That would equal the amount that we would spend for 45,000 veterans, giving them health care, new Border Patrol agents, 1,700, 46,000 more children could be in Head Start if we didn't have to spend $330 million a day. And final chart, I think this one's the most telling, of course. We spend on a daily basis $333 million on this war, unpaid for. In other words, our children will have to pay for this in the future. Yet when you take a look at the Gulf War, just 10, 15 years ago, that was our net total cost, $2.1 billion for the entire cost of that war. That's because we had allies in this so-called coalition who really did come forward. So, Dr. Orszag, I thank you for having come forward with this information. I hope the American public will understand that for the ordinary person in this country, there are costs to this war.
Will you yield?
I certainly do.
as compelling, reflecting back on your initial comments about the administration, as compelling as your charts and these soaring numbers are, surely this is a situation in which absence speaks much louder than words or statistics.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, my colleagues, for the opportunity to question.
Mr. McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Orszag, I want to thank you for your testimony and for providing such important information and analysis. While some of your testimony today builds on past reports, the impact of the Iraq War on the public debt is particularly important to this committee, which has the duty to draft a realistic budget. I only wish the President of the United States was listening and cared half as much about these issues as you do, as Chairman Spratt, and as other members of this committee do. I am troubled by the fact that the administration didn't send a witness here today. I'm troubled by the fact that so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are not here today. I get the feeling that some believe that if we don't talk about it, that we don't have to deal with it. But we've heard a lot this morning about the growing cost of the Iraq War, and this is a real issue. Now, I'd like to turn the conversation, if I may, to paying for the war. As your testimony illustrates, we are deep in debt from this war. Every second we borrow another $100 billion here and another $100 billion there to finance this war, the deeper and deeper into debt we go. And every morning, China and Japan and the Arab oil exporting states wake up and they buy the debt. We borrow money for this war and they hold the IOUs. We cannot keep borrowing money to pay for this war. We cannot keep putting it on the national credit card. Someday, somebody is going to have to pay for this war. And right now, the borrow and spend and borrow some more approach of the President means that somebody is going to be our kids and our grandkids. And that somebody is going to be the children and grandchildren of every military family in America, including those fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're going to have to pay for this. And that somebody is going to be the children of the wounded. Many grievously wounded, they're going to have to pay for this. So on top of all the sacrifice already demanded of their fathers and their mothers, this President is also demanding that their children sacrifice their financial security to pay off his Iraq War debt. Now, just as the President intends to dump his mess of a war onto the lap of the next President of the United States, he has also deliberately and, in my opinion, cynically chosen to dump paying for this war onto the next generation. So here's my question. If President Bush actually started to pay for the war beginning with FY 2008, how would that affect the budgetary costs of the war on the public debt? Now, he wouldn't be reaching back to pay for the $600 billion in borrowed money through FY 07, so that's still there accumulating debt interest. But imagine the President actually paying for FY 2008 and onward. What would the budgetary impact be if the President finally found the courage to pay for his war?
Again, it depends on sort of what the course of the future war looks like, but under the two scenarios we presented, if you offset the costs, you would reduce the impact on the debt by, in the slower phase-down case, by a little bit more than $1 trillion, and then there's some debt service on that too, so it's something like $1.2 trillion by 2017 if you paid for future activities.
Which is significant.
That is a significant amount of money, yes, sir.
I also think, sometimes, I think Mr. Becerra said this, we talk about these figures and, they're so enormous that I think people have kind of lost the ability to understand, what $100 billion is or what $160 billion is. I was trying to do some calculations here. I mean, $160 billion is, which is about 1 year of this war in Iraq, is equal to the entire budgets of the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Justice, including the FBI and the entire federal judiciary, Interior, Energy, Treasury, the Environmental Protection Agency, NASA. I mean, that's everything here in Washington. That's everything out in the field. I mean, we are spending a huge amount of money, and to put all this on our credit card with no accountability, with no plan to pay for it, I think is the height of irresponsibility. The fact of the matter is, sooner or later, the President somehow is going to have to find enough courage and integrity to pay for his war, or the disastrous budget impacts described by you and by some of the witnesses who will testify later are going to get worse and worse and worse than I think we've ever imagined here. So it will be just one more toxic legacy of this disastrous war that I think will leave our kids to have to clean up. But I think this committee in particular has a special responsibility to make sure that members of both parties stand up to the plate and assume responsibility for this war. I mean, this is a war that has been decided to be waged by this generation. And this generation ought not dump all the costs on the next generation. And I appreciate very much your testimony here today and all your analysis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. And now, Mr. Etheridge of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you for holding this hearing, because it is the role of this committee to try to help set a direction. And I think one of the things that's most troubling about all this today, a great deal of it is, but it's the amount of debt that we're piling up, as many of our colleagues have talked about. But let me ask you a question, and I'm sorry Mr. Ryan is not here right now, because he talked earlier about percent of GDP. My question to you is, if you can answer it succinctly, have you factored in the amount of borrowed money in the GDP? In other words, that is, the GDP does not include the amount of money we borrow. That's a part of the expenditure of each year, is it?
The calculations that I gave you today were both without and then with borrowing costs. So
Okay.
the 2.4
With
trillion
borrowing
has.
costs. But I think the chart we saw up here uses a portion of the expenditure of, that is the revenue coming in. Is the borrowed money a part of that revenue stream as you calculate the GDP?
I'm not sure what chart you were referring to, sir. I'm sorry.
It was a chart that Mr. Ryan put up. This chart.
Oh, yeah, that does not include, that's just the flow of spending each year,
Okay.
not including any interest on
At all.
outstanding government debt.
So if you use that chart, you really don't have a good frame of what is really happening in our budget process.
One of the reasons that,
Let me keep what I'm getting to.
Okay.
Because if you look
Thank
at
you.
World War II and you look at Vietnam, the amount of debt that the country held and the amount of interest we were paying would be substantially lower as a part of our GDP than it is today, because that is the fastest growing part of our budget today.
if you look over a long period of time, we've had evolution of debt as a share of GDP. It was very high at the end of World War II because we faced a very substantial military conflict, and there have been changes in both directions since then.
Okay. So here's what I'm getting to. If you look at the budget, look at the scenario you've laid out, and the amount of borrowed money we're assuming no one tackles the issue of paying for it. Can you give us any indication at what point the amount of interest we're paying is going to crowd out everything else within this budget, to include education, infrastructure? Because the amount of dollars available for the domestic side of the budget outside of the mandatory spending is continuing to be squeezed. At some point, as this interest rate continues to grow, even with the constant dollars you're showing without additional inflation, and obviously that's got to grow if we don't start paying our debt.
Let me put it this way. It is absolutely clear under any analysis that the nation is on an unsustainable fiscal path. And the kinds of scenarios that we are discussing this morning exacerbates that unsustainable fiscal path, in which higher debt and then higher interest costs will crowd out, will cause severe economic dislocation and problems eventually over time. That is exacerbated by additional spending on the war on terrorism, but it exists even in the absence of such spending. We are on an unsustainable fiscal path even without the type of money for the future that we're talking about in this hearing.
All right. Long and short of it is we got to start paying our bills with real money.
There is no question that a broad array of economists believe that it would be much better if we started offsetting the cost of new initiatives and if we as a nation started saving more.
I asked that question in that context because within the last week, I've talked to farmers who are now, we've asked the White House, we can't seem to get money to help them in the worst drought we've had in 100 years. I visited schools where children are in makeshift classrooms, and that's happening across this country. Truth is, we're squeezing out the opportunity to deal with our own infrastructure while we're helping with other infrastructure. And I think this, over the long run, will inhibit our ability as a nation to be able to grow and compete in this fast-moving economic climate we find ourselves around the world. Any disagreement with that fact?
Again, what I would say is there is no good outcome that comes from the fiscal path that we are on. We are borrowing nationally, in terms of the nation as a whole, we are borrowing an unsustainable amount from abroad. Every economist that I know believes that that will change. The only question is when and how. And the sooner that we address that set of those sets of challenges, the better.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Etheridge. We've got a vote coming up, but let's plow ahead in the hopes we can maybe end this round of questioning. Mr. Moore, Dennis Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Orszag, for being here. Mr. Edwards asked you questions about veterans' medical treatment. You recall those questions, sir?
Yes, sir.
And he asked you questions specifically about traumatic brain injury and the cost of treatment of those personnel. Do you recall those questions, sir?
I believe he asked about PTSD and traumatic brain injury.
He did, okay. What about traumatic brain injury? Do we have information on that in your statement and the information provided?
Yes, we do.
All right. What would be the cost? And I apologize. I apologize to Mr. Edwards. I had to step out during his questions. I had a constituent to meet. What would be the cost of providing medical treatment in the future to persons suffering from PTSD?
From PTSD?
Yes, sir.
We can get you the figures. We have existing figures from the Veterans Administration on how much it's costing currently, and those were used along with extrapolated healthcare inflation to project future costs.
Has the number of PTSD, persons suffering from PTSD, increased, to your knowledge, from past incidents, or do you know? Do you have that information?
The number has, as you'd expect, as the number of veterans exposed to stressful situations increases. I think the question that we struggle with is, how will the rate change? That is,
Yes,
you'd expect as the number of veterans goes up that more people will suffer from PTSD, but will the rate increase or decline? And those are some of the countervailing forces that I delineated in my answer to Mr. Edwards.
Yes, sir. Dr. Orszag, how many state National Guard units have been deployed, to your knowledge, to Afghanistan or Iraq? Do you have that information?
I don't, and
we can get it.
We can get it.
I would like to have that.
Okay.
Any idea how much equipment has been left behind by state National Guard units in Iraq, and at what cost?
We will also respond to you in writing on that.
All right. Do you know for a fact that that has happened in some circumstances, some cases, though?
Yes.
All right. Do you have any idea how many states have provided National Guard units? I mean, would it be a majority of the states, or do you know that?
We think so, yes.
Yes. And that would probably be at a cost of several $1 billion that you've not basically talked about in your information here. Is that correct? I mean, you've not addressed that situation.
Our costs are federal government costs. I just want to
exactly.
Clear about that.
And
Okay.
I'm not pointing the finger at you. I'm just saying that was something that was not covered by your testimony. Isn't that correct?
I think there's some ambiguity about that, and
All right.
we'll get back to you.
Thank you very much. And do you have any way of knowing what the equipment that was left behind by National Guard units would do to their readiness in the future, to respond to a similar situation in the future?
An obvious statement would be the more equipment that's left there and not replaced, the more difficult it is. There are currently difficulties in just even the regular military with, for example, trucks in particular,
Yes, sir.
more advanced trucks. So there are equipment shortages in various different parts of the military outside of the theater in question.
And I'm not trying to be critical of you by asking these questions, but these are part of the overall picture. Your study basically and your testimony related to the cost to our country, to our nation, for the deployment of troops and the equipment that was deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Isn't that correct?
The federal government effects, yes.
Right. But there are other costs to the states and the readiness potentially in the future. Would that also be a fair statement?
And let me just hone in on readiness. There
Yes,
is
sir.
no question. The military has set a sort of norm that there should be 2 units at home for every unit deployed abroad for regular readiness purposes and training and what have you. And we are nowhere near that. We're somewhere close to 1 for 1 with it ranges between 0.75 and 1.5 in terms of units at home relative to deployed abroad, and that is an unsustainable situation.
Would it be correct to say, based upon the national debt at the time, in the last, say, 6.5, 7 years ago, it was about $6 trillion, 5.8 to $6 trillion, and now it's over $9 trillion?
You're measuring gross debt.
Yes, sir.
And I prefer to use debt held by the public, but on gross debt figures, you're approximately correct.
Well, thank you. And I leave you to your preference, but I would like to state that the debt, under my circumstances, has gone up over $3 trillion in the past 6.5, 7 years. Is that correct, sir?
The gross debt increases will have gone up by, I'm just getting the exact number, but it'll just take me a second, something like that.
All right. And we can expect that figure to increase in the future based upon your testimony today and based upon what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq and our costs to our military. Is that correct as well, sir?
Yeah, at the end of fiscal year 07, gross federal debt was indeed $9 trillion. That figure will continue to increase. I would note, though, as an economist, the other concept of debt held by the public is the one that's typically used by the economics profession.
I understand. But we have mortgaged the future of our children and grandchildren. Is that correct?
The way I would put it is we are on an unsustainable fiscal path, and something has to give. There's
Thank
no
you
question
very much.
about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Orszag.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. Dr. Orszag, I just want to make sure we all have the same set of numbers. The additional debt service cost on the $196 billion supplemental, we've calculated at approximately $25 billion. You accept that number?
Over the next decade?
No, what is the number? Just in 1 year?
Oh no, that would be too high for the debt service on $200 billion for 1 year should be something, approximately $10 billion.
Approximately $10 billion.
Yeah.
And that amount is approximately half of the amount by which the total non-defense discretionary funding that the House has passed exceeds the President's request. Correct?
The disagreement between the Congress and the President over discretionary spending levels is a little bit more than $20 billion.
And that $20 billion is only about $6 billion above current services. Is that correct?
I think that's approximately correct.
Right. So we're looking to spend $6 billion above current services, and that amount has been described as representing fiscal irresponsibility. Yet it is an amount that is less than the additional debt service just on the Iraq supplemental. Is that correct?
$6 billion is less than $10 billion. Yes,
okay,
sir.
Thank you. Now, the FY07 supplemental was approximately $170 billion.
Correct.
And I believe I heard you say that approximately 30 to 50 billion of that remains unobligated at this time?
Yes, I'm just wondering, is it all from the FY07? Those are all FY07, yes. Okay.
And is that amount carried forward into FY08?
It can be obligated in. Oh yeah, I remember now. About 30 billion can be obligated. There's some authority that cannot, expires basically.
But some 30 billion could be carried forward. So if we were to approve the entire 196 billion requested, the budgetary authority would be approximately 226 billion for FY08 for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars?
We're mixing and matching a little bit because some of the 196 will presumably not be obligated in fiscal year 08.
I guess that gets to my question. In the President's transmittal to us, I'm just going to quote it. He said, "I hereby designate the specific proposals and the amounts requested herein as emergency requirements. This request represent urgent and essential requirements." If some 30 to 50 billion of the 170 billion, so 20 to 30% of the original request remains unobligated after the fiscal year is over, does that not beg the question of the level of urgency or the level of emergency associated with the request?
One complication is most of that money is in procurement and cannot, without some change, be used for operations and maintenance or other activities. So there's a sort of fungibility or transferability issue that would have to be addressed.
But there's some 60-some billion of procurement money in the 196, is that right?
Yes, I look up the exact figure,
So
but it's
procurement
significant.
could be as much, assuming they can get it all done, could be as much as $90 billion out of the 220-some billion?
Again, if you're mixing these two concepts together, yes.
I guess one of my concerns is, I think, I don't know whether you would agree or not, but we're 5 years into this war. We're funding it via supplementals. The fact that as much as a third of what had been requested as urgent in FY07 remains unobligated now that we are into FY08, does it not underscore the lack of desirability, for a lack of a better phrase, of funding this through supplementals? I mean, would we not be able to apply greater scrutiny? Would there not be greater planning associated with the expenditures if these were part of the regular budgetary process as opposed to these emergency supplemental processes?
There would generally be more scrutiny if everything were as part of the regular appropriations process. On the other hand, in fairness, it is often difficult to project out exact amounts far out in a military conflict. I would just come back, though, to the procurement point, which is, again, a large share and much of the increase in the supplementals is coming in this area. And I'll just come back to raising the questions that were raised in some of our reports about exactly what that is purchasing and whether it is directly tied to the war on terrorism or is accomplishing other objectives that the Defense Department would like to achieve and may be necessary for our overall military readiness, but are not directly tied to the war on terrorism.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Orszag, when was that 07 supplemental available to DOD to start spending?
Well, I can get you the exact dates. Hold on one second.
July-ish?
Yeah. May.
Certainly not October 1 of 07.
No.
Or 06, excuse me.
No.
Somewhere toward the last half of the fiscal year became available to DOD to spend?
There was, in May 2007, PL 11028 provided $95 billion out of the total. And I guess the other $70 billion was, I think the other $70 billion was available earlier on. So
Okay.
there's a split.
Right. But not the full year to get this money obligated?
Correct.
Right. Do you see anything just horrible about the fact that we've got some money that, based on the fact that this request was made in late 06, that there was some money that may not have been yet spent? Would have been wiser to obligate that money, to take this argument away if it wasn't to be obligated on things they really needed?
You long ago taught me not to use words like horrible.
There you go.
So, again, I would just come back to it looks like a big part of this has to do with the procurement
Okay.
in terms of unobligated amounts that have been provided in budget authority.
All right. The off the subject just a little bit, but talking about timing and getting things done, both the Senate and the House have both passed their versions of the Military Quality of Life 08 appropriations bill, and it's not at conference yet, not back to the House, it's not passed yet. We started the fiscal year October 1. Any sense of what the veterans have not been getting this month as a result of the delays in bringing this bill back to the House?
I don't have any information on that to provide.
If I said it was $18.5 million a day off the House version, that they're not getting those increased benefits while we sit and ponder the past, is that anywhere in the realm of?
I don't have any
Okay.
reason to doubt your figure.
All right. Well, let me put it this way: if in fact the Military Quality of Life appropriations budget or appropriations bill had an increase in it for 08 versus 07, can they spend that increase right now?
No, we are operating under a continuing resolution.
From the 07 levels.
That is correct.
So it's fair to say that whatever that increase is, if it's $18.5 million a day, and increased benefits to our veterans that are not getting it right now, that they're not getting those increases, whatever they might be.
That would be a direct conclusion from.
All right. Help me understand a little bit on the gross debt versus net debt. Are we not paying interest on the debt held by the Social Security Trust Fund and other things? Are we not paying interest on that?
The question arises as to, there is interest paid from the rest of the government to the Social Security Trust Fund and to the other trust funds whose debt is included in gross federal debt. There is a question about the degree to which those transfers between one part of the government and another part of the government represent the same net burden on the economy or net implications for the economy as net interest transactions between the government and the rest of the economy. So when one part of the government pays another part of the government interest, that is of a different nature than when the government pays private borrowers or private creditors, actually. Who had
Is that because the part of the government that's paying it is a revenue-generating part of the government where they're selling goods and services to somebody and they're actually earning that money separate and apart, or is that money actually coming from taxpayers also?
The way I would put it is we tend to look at the net impact of the budget on, for example, the nation's savings rate and on macroeconomic demand tends to be tied to the unified budget concept, which incorporates both Social Security and the rest of the budget.
Okay, that's a bit hocus pocus for mom and dad back home. Debt service that showed up in the budget is on the gross debt, right?
The debt service that shows up in the budget on on the bottom line when we say the budget deficit in fiscal year 07 was 1.2% of GDP, or was a little, roughly $160 billion, that's net interest. That is not gross. That's not the.
So that does not include the interest that is in effect owed to Social Security Trust Fund and will ultimately have to get paid out, assuming the federal government's good for its debt.
And again, the reason is because you're collapsing Social Security's part of the government, and so.
Well, I understand the mechanics. But when it comes time to pay that money out, 2017-ish.
We can have a very long discussion about the theology of the Social Security Trust Fund.
I'm just talking about the net versus gross debt.
It ties back to the broader question of the meaning of the Social Security Trust Fund and the mechanics of how those transactions are undertaken. And I would just go back to saying the headline figures that we tend to use for the budget deficit relate to net interest paid to the public and not.
Yeah, I'm a CPA by trade, and we're hiding the truth when we use a net deficit that eliminates the Social Security excesses that are collected each year to reduce our unified budget deficit. I think that's hiding the truth as well. Mr. Orszag, appreciate you being here, buddy. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
This is Moore of Wisconsin, but let me say we've got 5 minutes and 12 seconds to cast our votes. And Mrs. Moore, if you would yield 30 seconds to Mr. Edwards, we'll then save the balance of your time and come back as quickly as possible. We've got 2 votes, but the second vote will follow shortly after this one. Mr. Edwards.
Mr. Chairman, in response to my friend and colleague, Mr. Conaway's comments, let me say into the record that last year, under Republican leadership, this Congress failed to even pass a VA appropriation bill. Yet this year we're hearing Republicans concerned we're now 24 days in the new fiscal year. 2006 they didn't pass it until November 30th, 2005 December 8th, 2004 January 23rd, 2003 February 20th, 2002 November 26th. It seems that the concern that Republicans have today, this year under Democratic leadership in the Congress, which has increased veteran spending by $5.2 billion already this year. It seems like there's a lot more concern than there was during the 10 years Republicans were in control. And by the way, the last time Republicans passed a VA appropriation bill on time was 1996. I yield back.
I am amazed and concerned that such a small colleagues from across the aisle have chosen to attend, and also that the administration has chosen not to participate in these hearings. As I understand that they were offered the chance and encouraged to do so, but they chose not to do that. I have several questions, Dr. Orszag. I think you're a good and honorable man. You have a very difficult job. I appreciate the way that you do it and present it in as honest a way as it is humanly possible to do. And over in the short time I've been on this committee, people in a position like yours come before us and tell us that one of the problems they have is it's difficult to track money at the Department of Defense. There's just not enough transparency. From time to time, it's hard to tell where the money is, who got it, what to spend it for, what have you. Am I stating that correctly?
I think it's fair to say that there is not we don't have full transparency into the budget systems to the degree that it would be beneficial to have.
I find myself, maybe it's a function of my age, I just got my Medicare card, and I'm beginning to get maybe a little bit more focused on my children and grandchildren than I have been in the past, but I find myself very concerned. I think history's road is littered with the remains of great nations that got bogged down in the war and ended up spending their entire fortune and all they could borrow to go with it to deal with that, and it ended up bringing the country down. And I would certainly hope that we would make the right decisions here and get ourselves on a path to a successful nation and not one that is just continuing to bog itself down in debt. I don't know if you can even have the ability to answer this or not, but when the war was begun, when the president made that decision, he told us that the oil revenues in Iraq would be enough to pay for the reconstruction. And do you have any idea how much how much that revenue is, where it's going? Does it go back to the Iraqi Treasury, to the U.S. Treasury? Do they actually pay for anything themselves?
I think the clearest answer to that is that the reconstruction activities that we're undertaking on net have cost us. I gave you the figure over the past, through 2007. So it is not the case that any revenue generated from Iraq or elsewhere has been sufficient to offset the costs of what we have been undertaking.
But you don't have knowledge of where that money goes.
Yeah, we could respond in writing, but the short answer is that we can give you the figures, but in terms of tracing exactly where the money goes, that is a more difficult undertaking.
Right. I think you had a line item in your testimony that mentioned international operations. Would that be the State Department? And what I'm really trying to get at here is these private security forces like Blackwater. Are they included in this supplement? Do we pay for them out of DOD money, or does State Department pay for them?
I believe that most of those that money is included in the figures that we have given you.
Okay. Well, it seems as though my colleagues from across the aisle are determined to try to make chicken salad out of chicken litter, and it's pretty difficult to do. And as much as we would all like to see a rosy picture, and goodness knows we're all ready for one, especially when it comes to this war and to Iraq, and as well-intentioned as I think you and your colleagues are, if you came here to cheer me up this morning, it's not working. And I thank you very much for your time and your knowledge.
And I'm sorry we didn't cheer you up, but I guess that was not the intention of the hearing necessarily.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Ms. Moore of Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I was very intrigued by a line of questioning that the ranking member was following when he indicated that perhaps the cost of the war was overstated. He said that the supplementals plus the regular budget and the debt service and the costs that you included beyond inflation, such as I would imagine healthcare costs and unpredictable things, were an overstatement. And I was very intrigued, very excited, as a matter of fact, when he sort of suggested that if we were to diminish our commitment to certain Cold War assets and equipment, that we could perhaps have a different outcome. Just briefly, I know you haven't had time really to do any number crunching on this, but I was very intrigued by that line of questioning, and I'm wondering, would that amount to a tremendous difference if we were to exclude those Cold War assets from your future calculations?
Well, I guess the way I would put it is there are clearly significant opportunities, many of which are identified in the CBO budget options volume that we put out, for example, at the beginning of this year, to modify the course of future defense spending through changes in policy. And there are undoubtedly there are many policy choices that you all could make to alter the path of future defense spending.
Thank you. You talked in your testimony about having greater access to the cost model that DOD utilizes. And I am wondering, there was a provision in the appropriations bill that would add a little bit more teeth to the 90-10 measuring stability and security reports, which do not contain metrics on war costs and are not required by law. Do you think that would that be helpful to you in your analyses?
I'm being told by the people who know, not really.
Not really. Okay. I am wondering if you are familiar with the Unified Security Budget, a report of the task force, the principal authors being Miriam Pemberton and Lawrence Korb, from the Foreign Policy and Focus, Institute for Policy Studies, and Center for American Progress, and Center for Defense Information. Here they basically talk about the appropriateness of, number one, providing the full costs of the defense budget and war budgets as a unified budget, but in addition to that, the foreign ops budget, the diplomatic efforts, a unified approach. They say that a unified security budget would pull together in one place U.S. spending on all of its security tools, military forces, homeland security, and prevention, quite frankly, non-military international engagement. I'm wondering if you have ever undertaken some sort of analyses or would undertake an analysis of what impact a unified budget would have.
I think in general, and this has arisen with regard to homeland security spending and in other areas, efforts like that can often provide more transparency and a better trade-off across different subcomponents of related efforts. There is a difficulty, though, in the way that the Congress is organized in jurisdiction across both authorizing committees and appropriation subcommittees in that kind of effort. So it's difficult to have an aggregate budget for some activity that is split among lots of different committees, and that often leads to complications that would need to be taken into account in evaluating that kind of approach.
Okay, in my final seconds, I just wanted to revisit some of the comments that the ranking member made as he challenged your projections on the defense budget. And he talked about balancing the budget. I am wondering, in his question and in your response, did you consider that defense is not subject to PAYGO?
That is correct. Discretionary spending is not subject to the pay-as-you-go rules.
And so what was the relevancy? I guess I was not able to fully follow that your give and take on that, because neither of you mentioned that fact. So when he started talking about the Republicans balancing the budget by, I believe, 2012, I'm wondering what were his assumptions as you understood them about that.
Let me separate two things. One is what happens after 2012 and before under any projection in which the budget's balanced and goes into surplus after 2012 versus the question that you're asking, which is the spending we're talking about is discretionary spending. And one of the reasons that CBO traditionally doesn't attach debt service costs to changes in something like discretionary spending is it's really hard to parse out what is, you're collecting $100 in revenue and then you're spending something. How much of the existing revenue is going for this kind of spending versus that kind of spending? It's much clearer when you're changing a mandatory program or a flow of taxes, the stuff that's subject to PAYGO. If you're not offsetting it, then it's clearly adding to the budget deficit and it has the debt service implications that that then follow. On the discretionary side, I think the thought concept is there's a certain level of discretionary spending that's embodied, for example, in the baseline, or that would occur in the absence of the war. And if the war is additional spending that's not offset in the rest of the budget, that has additional debt service costs. And as I tried to make clear to Mr. Ryan, that occurs regardless of whether the budget overall is in surplus or deficit. The key thing is whether any additional costs are offset somewhere else in the budget.
Thank you so much, and I would yield back.
And now Mr. Doggett has a couple of questions to wrap up.
Thank you very much. And I would again note that throughout this hearing, at no point has there been, except for one very brief moment, has there been more than one Republican member present, and now there are no Republican members present, not because we discourage their participation, but for reasons that they can explain. I would like to redirect Mr. Orzog's testimony to an inquiry I had earlier that I got cut a little short on. Many of us feel that this surge was a serious mistake, that it has not accomplished its purpose. I understand it is not your function to analyze that aspect of it, but just looking purely at the dollars and cents, at the time that you made your estimate at the Congressional Budget Office, you were criticized vigorously earlier this year, just as this administration has criticized almost everyone who differed with it on anything about the Iraq War. I note in particular that it was said that you had greatly overestimated the cost of the surge, and I would just ask you to respond generally on how the estimates of the Congressional Budget Office compare with the actual cost of the surge in this fiscal year.
The cost of the surge is very closely tied to the number of troops involved. We had originally put forward a range that at the lower bound was 35,000 additional troops. We are now above that. So I think the record shows that our analysis was right on target. Again, a credit to the outstanding staff that CBO has. And to the extent that the administration had criticized that original analysis, the facts as they have turned out have not been kind to that criticism.
I thank you. In fact, I believe Secretary Gates said you greatly overestimated this. Rather, the truth is that this administration, from its original $50 billion estimate on the cost of the war in Iraq, right through the estimates that are being made outside this committee today, consistently lowballs, misstates to the American people the true cost of the dollars and, of course, the true cost in blood that we are paying for this go-it-alone misadventure. I want to ask you about one other aspect of that, again, just asking you about the numbers. At the onset of this war, we were told by the administration that as far as the cost of reconstruction, that this was going to be an easy matter, that it would be handled through the Iraqis themselves because they were in a rich country. How much have the cost of the Iraq War on the reconstruction side, how much have we already paid out versus this self-pay claim that was made at that time? I believe specifically on March 27th of 2003, the comment was the oil revenues of Iraq could bring between 50 and 100 billion over the course of the next 2 or 3 years. We're dealing with a country that can really finance its own reconstruction, and relatively soon. Paul Wolfowitz said here in testimony in the House.
There is no question, and in the figures that I gave you for 2001 through 2007, you saw that a subcomponent of the $39 billion cost over the over that period, which is part of the overall $600 billion, is for reconstruction, and there's no question that there's a significant amount of net effect negative, that is extra cost in that area. In other words, it is not the case that reconstruction efforts have paid for themselves.
Have you done any analysis of how much of our appropriations have actually gone to pay for weapons for those who are opposing us? There's been, I know, a General Accountability Office study showing a significant diversion of weapons to the insurgents. Has there been any analysis of that at CBO?
We have not done that. That's more of a GAO.
And then there's also been an indication that a significant amount of money, I believe the most recent purchase proposed $100 million of our appropriations going to buy the Iraqis weapons from the Chinese. Have you done any analysis of how much money has been expended on purchasing weapons from China, Russia, Iran?
No, we have not.
And with reference to the so-called, a bit of fiction and illusion, the so-called coalition of the willing, have you done any analysis of how much this administration has spent already and how much it has committed us to in the future to buy members of the coalition of the willing so that they would be willing?
Again, I wouldn't necessarily use that that kind of terminology, but
you speak more as an economist than an accountant. I'm just speaking about the practical implications.
The information I have is that the Department of Defense has reported using $1.2 billion of its, or in the material for 2008 that it's requested, $1.2 billion of its funds for support of coalition partners in 2006 and $1.4 billion in 2007. That was part of the material that it used to justify its 2008 request.
And that's out of its appropriation request for Iraq?
Again, those numbers are from the past, and yes, it's part of this overall total, but we have the information from the request that they submitted for 2008.
Does that include building a missile defense system in Poland and the Czech Republic?
No.
So I don't know whether that's being done because of all the renditions and the hidden prisons there are more directly related to Iraq. Does it include any trade benefits that were given to any of these alleged willing partners?
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. And Dr. Herzog, that concludes your testimony, unless there's some parting remarks you'd like to leave with us. So thank you very much for your participation, for your excellent answers, and to your entire staff for the solid work they've done in the preparation of this report. We are very grateful.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. We'll now turn to the second panel, which consists of Amy Belasco of the Congressional Research Service and Professor Linda Bilmes of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Okay, she goes first. Yeah. I've already mentioned that. Ms. Bilmes, Ms. Velasco, thank you both for your participation and the effort you put into the preparation of your testimony. As we previously indicated, your prepared testimony will be made part of the record, and you can summarize it as you see fit. Ms. Bilmes, let's begin with you, if that's agreeable to the two of you. The floor is yours, and you can summarize your statement to the extent you see fit. Thank you once again for coming, and thank you for your fine work. Push it and hold it just a minute, and it'll come on.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Spratt and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today to speak on this important topic. I'm Linda Bilmes, a professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And as you know, for the past 2 years, I've been studying the total cost of the Iraq conflict, particularly the cost of caring for our veterans, with my colleague, Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University. The paper that we published 2 years ago estimated that the cost of the war would range from $1 to $2 trillion. That was 2 years ago. We are currently updating that study, but so far our predictions have come closer than we even could have anticipated. I have been asked to speak today about the long-term accrued costs and the non-budgetary costs of the war. By long-term accrued costs, I refer to costs that we have already incurred but not yet paid, such as providing lifetime disability compensation and medical care to veterans with disabilities. And by non-budgetary costs, I refer to the cost that the government does not pay, but someone else is bearing the cost. For example, the families taking care of wounded soldiers who return home, the loss of economic productivity when a soldier is killed or injured, and the impact on the economy of macroeconomic factors such as the price of oil. Finally, I was asked to say a word about the cost of paying interest on the money that we have borrowed to finance the war. The key message that I want to deliver is that these additional costs are very significant and very real. We estimate that the cost of providing disability benefits, medical care, and Social Security disability compensation to veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan is between $350 and $500 billion over the course of their lives. This is based on claims activity by OIF, OEF veterans to date, plus extrapolation of data from the first Gulf War. We estimate that the cost of replenishing military equipment that is being used up faster than it is being replaced is in excess of $100 billion. However, I want to note that the transparency in the Defense Department accounts on this topic is very poor, so this may well understate the true amount. We estimate that the economic loss to the country from the death of more than 4,000 soldiers, U.S. soldiers in the conflict, is at least $30 billion, based on using the standard valuation of statistical life methodology that the civilian government agencies such as OSHA, EPA, and FDA adopt. This is a case where the official government estimates of the war significantly understate the true cost because the budgetary cost of a lost soldier is $500,000 as opposed to the $6 to $7 million which civilian agencies use to estimate a loss. We expect the economic losses to the country from soldiers who are wounded, injured, or incapacitated by mental health illness will add between $200 to $300 billion to the cost of the war. This is based on a new analysis we have conducted with the assistance of a team of neurologists and psychiatrists at 5 VA hospitals and at the UCSF Medical School, shortly to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as research published by the Veterans Disability Benefits Commission just last month. Another cost is the cost to the families. 1 out of every 5 disabled veterans, according to the Dole-Shalala Commission, has had a family member who has had to leave his or her job to become a full-time caretaker. Other families have had to make other adjustments, not completely leaving their jobs, but other adjustments. And we estimate the economic loss from this as $40 billion. I have not included, but I want to note the issue of quality of life impairment. Many countries, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, pay lump sums purely for quality of life impairments. Those lump sums reach up to $500,000. And the President, in his current proposals for reforming the disability compensation, has proposed that we include a quality of life payment. Turning to the macroeconomic effects of the war, the effect on the price of oil, which has risen from $25 a barrel before the war to $90 a barrel now, is also a cost to the economy. Even if we attribute only $5 to $10, you're used to this, but I'm not. Even if we attribute only
yield. There are about 14 minutes left for the vote, so there should be ample time for you to finish. So we're prepared to.
Even if we, talking about the cost of oil, even if we attribute only $5 to $10 of this increase to the Iraq conflict, the impact on the economy is from $175 to $400 billion. The multiplier effect of this price increase, that is the amount that consumers spend less on other goods, adds another at least $187 billion. Finally, interest costs can be thought about in 3 ways. And first, there is the money that we have already spent on what we have already borrowed. That amounts to about $85 billion, including $58 billion for Iraq. Second, there's the interest on money that we still have to pay in the future on what we have already borrowed, which adds another $450 billion. Third is the interest cost that we need to pay in the future on money which we will borrow in the future. We have not included an estimate of this, but it would be, depending on the assumptions used, very considerable. In summary, the budgetary cost of the war that we see capture only a fraction of the total costs. And taken together, we estimate that all of these costs I've described add nearly $1 billion on top of the total cost of the war that the government estimates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Velasco, we have about 12 minutes, so let's get started.
Chairman Spratt and other distinguished members of the committee, thank you for asking the Congressional Research Service to testify about the important issue the committee is considering, the growing cost of the war in Iraq. This testimony makes the following key points. First, CRS estimates that Congress has provided about $615 billion to date for Iraq, Afghanistan, and enhanced security at defense bases, including appropriations to the Department of Defense, the State Department, NAID, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. This includes monies provided in the fiscal 2008 continuing resolution. This total includes about $455 billion for Iraq, $127 billion for Afghanistan, and $28 billion for enhanced security. On October 22nd, as you know, the administration submitted an additional request, which includes an additional request. Of $43.6 billion. If Congress chooses to provide those funds, CRS estimates the total war costs would reach about $803 billion, including some $192 billion in fiscal 2008 for Iraq and Afghanistan. Our preliminary estimate is that if Congress chose to appropriate the monies in this request, the total for Iraq would reach about $609 billion, and $160 billion for Afghanistan. In recent years, war costs have more than doubled from some $72 billion in fiscal 2004 to $165 billion in fiscal 2007. Most of this increase does not appear to reflect changes in either the number of deployed personnel or increases in the intensity of operations. Rather, the increase reflects a number of unanticipated requirements for force protection gear and equipment, funding to train partners to train and equip Afghan and Iraq security forces, and the single largest factor that results in part from a broadened definition of those expenses that are war-related, monies for reset, to repair, replace, and, as the Pentagon has defined it, upgrade war-worn equipment. There are also increases due to various programs which have a more indirect connection to war costs. Because war funding has generally been provided as emergency supplemental appropriations, the administration and the Defense Department develop their requests on a separate track and may not make the same kind of trade-offs that are made between programs in the regular budget. Like other funding requests, DoD's war requests are assessed by OMB and the President, but funding levels are not subject to the same budget caps or to long-term budget plans as DoD's regular spending. Relying on emergency supplemental appropriations has both advantages and disadvantages. Potential advantages include meeting wartime needs more expeditiously, providing the services with more capable equipment for future needs, enabling the services to buy large amounts of equipment, ranging from trucks to radios, that have proved important for war funding and that were not funded in previous DoD budgets, buying equipment earlier than planned, and meeting some unanticipated requirements for counterinsurgency warfare. Potential disadvantages would include potentially increasing readiness problems and from equipment shortages, because DoD has chosen to upgrade rather than do standard maintenance in some equipment, and upgrading takes longer than standard maintenance. Purchasing some equipment whose requirements have not been fully vetted, funding programs that may not have been subject to the same scrutiny as those in the regular budget, and reducing visibility on total program costs and potentially eroding budget discipline. To address potential effects like these, Congress could either require DoD to restore its earlier stricter definition of war costs, which has been changed in regulation and hence reflects a policy decision, or another alternative would be to delay consideration of much of the fiscal 2008 reset request until the submission of the fiscal 2009 regular budget, when baseline requirements could also be considered potentially at the same time. CRS estimates that in fiscal 2008, DoD has about $45 billion in unobligated balances available from previous war appropriations, which could be used to meet many of the urgent war needs until passage of the fiscal 2008 emergency supplemental request. Finally, as requested, CRS has estimated that the Army could finance or cash flow its war operating expenses without passage of the fiscal 2008 supplemental until about mid-January of 2008. They would do this by using funds that would otherwise be used later in the year. If DoD transferred additional funds to the Army and the Army slowed non-readiness related operating funding, as has occurred in previous years, we estimate that the Army could finance operations until mid-February 2008. Thank you very much.
Make a vote. With your patience and forbearance, we will go and come back as quick as we can. We have 2 votes. We'll get that just as we're ending. I want to make sure that there'll be some coming back because I certainly have questions I'd like to put, but if that's agreeable with you, we'll be back as quickly as possible. Okay?